Moorish, Orthodox, Radio, Crusade. Anarchism for the global city. Radical environmentalism for the concrete jungle. Esoteric explorations of the secret history of rebel culture. The Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. Exiled from WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City. Now only on the World Wide Web. Be there.
Well, welcome aboard to the 5th YouTube edition of the Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. Hello, all you out there in cyberspace. And we're joined this evening by Andrew Kliman, who is a Marxist economist and the author of 2 books. People who were listening on WBAI just at the time of the crash. I believe it was about this time of year in 2008. We had him on the air doing his analysis of the capitalist system teetering on the brink, as he argued. In fact, it was at that point. And talking about his book, which had just come out at that point, Reclaiming Marx's Capital, a refutation of the myth of inconsistency. But he's got a new book out now, more about the crisis per se, entitled The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying Causes of the Great Recession, available from Pluto Press in England. So welcome aboard, Andrew Kliman.
Thank you. It's also available here from all the online booksellers, and Palgrave Macmillan is the U.S. distributor. Mm-hmm. Thanks for having me on again, Bill.
Of course. And one of the things I really liked about the book, I should preface it by saying that I have a very limited capacity to understand anything which has got economic formulas in it. I can barely do simple addition. But one of the things that I liked about it was that, for the past, ever since Reagan, we've all sort of been obsessed with neoliberalism or globalization or free trade or whatever you want to call it. And those are, good things to be against, without a doubt. But there's been, a danger of forgetting that the more fundamental problem is actually capitalism. And this has led to, it's led to people not having their eye on the ball, even within the Occupy Wall Street movement, which has started to reemerge, showing the left beginning to reemerge and an anti-capitalist left beginning to reemerge. But, we'll talk about this more later, but, there's been a certain unwillingness to square with being forthrightly anti-capitalist.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that also what we get is what is in fact tilting against neoliberalism or a certain faction of capital presents itself now as anti-capitalism. You have a lot of people, Marxist economists or self-styled Marxist economists, who are explicitly calling for multi-class alliances against neoliberalism, financialized capitalism, and so forth. And I think to some degree the rhetoric of the 1% versus the 99% reflects that kind of orientation. I don't blame the Occupy Wall Street people. Most of them are very young, and they're reflecting what they're hearing from the New York Times leftward.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that there's anything wrong per se with the notion of a multi-class alliance against financialized capitalism, as long as quite notoriously we can be critical of it from a distance of 50 years, but in the 30s and the 40s, there was the Popular Front, and people who were anti-capitalist in their own politics, sort of made a tactical compromise given, the world situation. And that may not necessarily be an inappropriate thing now, but we should be conscious that, we are anti-capitalist.
Well, let me try to answer it this way. The specific problem that I have with these calls for, a movement against financialized capitalism, or however it's phrased, is that this is posed as a way of solving the crisis in the sense of it will prevent recurrent financial crises of the same kind, getting out of the problems that have caused the Great Recession and the new normal, so-called, that we're now in. That would make sense if those problems are fundamentally problems of a particular form of capitalism, and if this is essentially just a bunch of problems that were caused by financialization and financialized capitalism, and they don't go deeper than that. But if they go deeper than that, and you want to deal with those problems, you have to deal with those problems, which I think means you have to deal with the real guts, the real innards of capitalism, and not, just this group of people in control or finance or whatever. Certainly, there was a bubble in the home price. There was a bubble in the housing market in this country that triggered a big financial crisis, and the crisis triggered the Great Recession. But we're now 4 years into that period. The recession was officially dated to have begun 4 years ago, December of '07, and it was officially dated to have ended 18 months later, June of 2009. And we're now 2.5 years after that.
Approaching the brink, if not quite back to the brink, it seems,
yeah,
given what's going on in Europe.
It might be back to the brink. I wouldn't want to speculate about that. Things are not good. I mean, employment is still way down.
Right,
Home prices are still way down. We're not out of the woods.
Notorious jobless recovery, quote unquote.
Right. I mean, so the bubble burst. If it were just a matter of a financial crisis, though, you would bounce back. I mean, countries do bounce back oftentimes from financial crises very readily because there's nothing really underlying that. The basic idea is that when an economy is vulnerable, a shock can affect it and really cause a lot of damage for a long time. If an economy is basically resilient, the same shock isn't going to do the same kind of damage. And we're in that situation where there has been a lot of vulnerability, and so it looks, if you just look at it, oh yeah, it's a financial crisis, sure, causes a recession, sure, but there's a deeper problem, and so just blaming it all on one segment, of the capitalist class, one group of politicians, and so forth, it's very good for an election campaign of the other guys, and it's very good for trying to be on their Council of Economic Advisors or the equivalent in Europe.
Well, who are the other guys? I'm not sure there are any other guys exactly. I mean, there seems to be bipartisan consensus, despite all of the bitter acrimony and paralysis in Washington. There's bilateral consensus on globalization and the U.S. continuing to be the superpower, which is, the guardian of global capitalism and free trade. I'm not sure there are any other guys exactly, despite the fact that, of course, all of these ultra-right yahoos who have been mainstreamed, accuse Obama of being a socialist, which is an absurdity, nearly to the point of hallucination.
I mean, I think you're right. I think that this campaign against against financialized capitalism and this whole multi-class alliance, I mean, I don't see it as succeeding anywhere in the realm of actual politics. Certainly not in this country.
Well, it depends what you mean by succeeding. I mean, it succeeded in the 30s to an extent, at least to the point that, there was a New Deal for the working class in this country, and the system survived. So, it was a success within the terms of the debate, for both ends, for the working class and the ruling class, it was a success.
Right, but if you're going to have an alliance, you have to have somebody to ally with you, and if the whole consensus is the other way,
yes.
Your alliance, your call for an alliance isn't materializing. That's all I meant.
All right, well, we can move on maybe in the second half of the discussion as to what you see as the appropriate way forward. But let's first talk about, which is more what your book is about what the actual roots of the crisis are. And you're basically arguing that contrary to the conventional wisdom, there really wasn't any real recovery from the downturn of the 1970s, that there was this period of tremendous growth from the immediate aftermath of the Second World War through the recession of the 70s, and since then we've just seen these illusory bubbles, but we haven't actually seen any real sustainable growth.
That's a slight exaggeration.
Okay.
I say that we've experienced a period of relative stagnation and incomplete recovery.
Okay.
It hasn't been a stagnant economy in the sense of totally flat, no growth, but certainly there is a huge change from capitalism right after World War II until the early 70s and what we've had since. I mean, the economic crisis of 1973 to 75 is really the watershed for so many things in the U.S. And abroad.
And yet, since then,
actually, Bretton Woods agreement falling apart a couple of years before then is also a key watershed moment.
Bretton Woods agreement falling apart, meaning
that was the coming out of World War II. Countries were no longer on the gold standard, so they met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and put together this agreement where these other countries said, okay, we'll take dollars in lieu of gold. And
so you mean Nixon getting us off the international gold standard?
Yeah, the international gold standard. Bretton Woods was the international gold standard. And Nixon said, no, you're holding this paper, we're not going to give you gold.
All right. Well, since then, we've seen at least two major booms. We saw, the Reagan boom and the Clinton boom in the 80s and the 90s, respectively.
And there was a boom in the middle of the last decade.
Not like the previous ones.
Well, the stock market basically doubled from 03 to 07. Home prices doubled.
Right.
Employment was growing at a pretty decent clip. Not huge, but in a sense there was boom. Profitability was way up. The rate of profit went way up from the low point of 01, 02 up through 2006, 2007. So, if you just look at the data and you want to say we're not looking in retrospect, it was another bubble.
Okay.
All right, so I think
here's the key word is bubble, though, right?
Oh yeah,
yeah. So you want to elaborate on that?
Right. Well, I think what you had, not so much in the 80s, but what you had in the 90s, and what you had in the last decade were bubbles. In the 90s, you had the dot-com bubble. That was called the dot-com boom, and you had all these new internet companies, and you had internet sales. And, I mean, basically, a lot of people thought all of the old laws of economics were passé. And the Internet was going to change everything and make growth out of, who knows what, silicon, I guess. And so
then the second one in the past decade was
fueled by the big run-up of home prices. And what was behind that was the Federal Reserve lowering short-term lending rates down to ridiculously low levels. So there was a lot of cash out there that banks and non-bank entities, like shadow banks, that they could play with. And that was all in response to the collapse of the first bubble. So the dot-com bubble turned into the dot-com bust. And the Federal Reserve comes along and says, oh my God, we might be going the way of Japan, because around 1990, big stock market bubble in Japan burst, big real estate bubble in Japan burst, and Japan's never come back. And so they were worried about that happening in the U.S., and then along comes 9/11 and all kinds of problems, and they just drive short-term interest rates, the Fed does, down to low levels for a very, very long time. That and some other things just led to this big unsustainable run-up of home prices. You know, home prices just, I mean, they double in a very short period. Why? Well, there's no reason, and that's what makes it a bubble, and it did crash.
Okay, but you're vindicating or attempting to vindicate in your book Marx's thesis of the long-term falling rate of profit.
Yeah, I didn't start out to do any of this actually, but I started around the time, or shortly after the time, when I was last on your show. At that time, my head was in what's going on right now with TARP and what's going on with, Lehman Brothers and all of that. But then I started to look at a number of things, and the reason this became a book was not because, okay, let me sit down and I want to write a book on the topic, underlying causes of the Great Recession or the crisis. It developed kind of accidentally, because the more I started to look at the numbers, from the U.S. government mostly and from other sources, the more I saw that there were fundamental flaws in what I call the conventional left account of the underlying causes, which basically the account is there was the 1970s, a big slump into the early 80s, but then the neoliberals come along, Reagan, Thatcher, and they depress wages, and that increases the exploitation of the workers, and with the lower wages, the rate of profit recovers. It recovers almost entirely, and so you would think we would have a really strong economy under neoliberalism, but they've got all this profit, the companies do, but they're not investing in production. They're investing in the stock market, they're investing in derivatives, but not in production. Why? Well, that's financialization. It's this new thing that's going on with neoliberalism.
And yet they are investing in production overseas. They're investing in production in Mexico.
And they're investing in production in the United States. That's one of the things I found out. If you say, what is the investment in production as a share of company profits, it has not gone down.
Oh.
Under the neoliberal period.
Even within our borders?
Even within our borders. Okay? I mean,
there's very little production happening within our borders.
And there's very little investment. But it's not a lower share of the profit. Okay? The key thing is that the profit's going down relatively. When you say the profit's going down relatively compared to the amount invested already, that's what the rate of profit is.
All right, now when you say the profit is going down relatively, what exactly does that mean? Because it seems to me that every time I look at the headlines, Exxon has made, another year of record-breaking profits. So what? There's certainly absolute profits and the rate of profit.
Yeah, I mean, and you're looking at just Exxon, not at all corporations, and that matters a lot because last year, the year before, we heard about, or this past year and the year before, big rebound in profit, but the small corporations in this country, were basically still hurting. Their profits were going down, according to the National Federation of Independent Business Association of Small Companies. But, profit going down relatively means profit compared to how much you've invested. In this case, in production. So we heard that, basically the neoliberals managed to put everything right in terms of how the system produces profits, and then the problem was just that the companies are part of this new financialization, and they're playing, in the stock market, they're buying each other up, they're doing all kinds of things with their profit instead of sinking the profit back into production. And as a result, we've had the relative stagnation that I've been talking about. There's agreement there. And as a result of the relative stagnation, you get these attempts to prop up the economy artificially with debt, and that's behind all of this. So there's no real disagreement with regard to the last 2 points, slow growth and attempts to manage the slow growth with covering it over with debt. But it is not the case that a smaller share of U.S. corporations' profit from 1981 through 2001, the share of profits plowed back in production was actually higher than in the 1947 to 1980 period. Okay. It wasn't a lot, but it was a larger share of the profit, slightly larger. It just is not the case that then the profits are being shifted out of productive investment and into portfolio investment.
Mm-hmm. So what is the case?
The case is that the rate of profit as a percentage of investment has gone down.
Why?
Wait a minute.
Okay.
It's gone down, and as a consequence of that, the productive investment has gone down as a share of investment as well. Let me show you what I think is like the key.
Okay.
The key graph in the entire book. I'm absolutely amazed by this. I don't know if the YouTube audience can see this. The darker line is the rate of profit. The dotted line is investment as a share of the capital. So the profit is, the rate of profit is profit as a share of capital. The other one is investment in production as a share of capital. And you see that the dotted line, the investment as a share of capital, tracks the rate of profit very closely. The rate of profit goes way down. This is 2001, 2002. The investment as a share of capital, what's called the rate of accumulation, comes way down. Okay. And the rate of profit precedes the rate of accumulation by a bit, which seems to indicate that that's the cause, and what's going on with investment is a response. So what's going on with investment is a response to what's going on with profitability. Profitability is going down. There's a downward tendency of the investment as a share of profit. There's a very strong relationship there. I was surprised to see that strong of a relationship. But basically, what that graph shows, and the other computations I did show, is that the entire decline in this investment as a share of capital is accounted for by the fall in profitability, not by a diversion of funds not by a diversion of profits away from productive investment and into portfolio investment into financial markets.
All right. Well, the fundamental question, I guess, is why that is. But first, I was just one thing which occurred to me is your claim that your claim about that contrary to the sort of what you call the conventional left account, which is that workers are not being paid less in real terms than they were paid decades ago. This is you refuting the conventional left account. Is that so? Because on page 69, you write that by 2008, hourly compensation was far less than it would have been if the trend between 1948 and 1974 had persisted, meaning, the big post-war boom. So I'm having a hard time reconciling these two things.
Oh, okay. Well,
am I missing something?
From 47 to 73, compensation of workers, wages, benefits, was growing very rapidly. Okay. After that point, it didn't grow very rapidly. So by 2008 or whatever, it was far less than it would have been if it had continued to grow at the rate it grew during the first half of the post-war period. But it did continue to grow. So it hasn't gone down. So it's grown more slowly, but it hasn't gone down. Why has it grown more slowly? Because the economy's grown more slowly. Okay. It's grown more slowly because, in other words, the output or the income produced by the corporations is growing, but it's growing at around half, maybe a little bit more than half at the rate that it grew in the first part of the post-war period.
Well, I may be atypical, but I'm certainly making way less than I was even just 10 or 15 years ago, which has to do with, the downsizing of the journalism industry and the hypertrophy of the internet, to which I am forced to contribute right now by the fact that I was booted from WBAI, which is also part of the same trend, I think, in some ways. And notoriously, I mean, more and more people are, working freelance or as a contract labor and don't have any job security, don't have any benefits, and are struggling along, particularly in New York City, and particularly among my friends, struggling along as freelancers, living from paycheck to paycheck. I mean, so I understand why at least there's a perception that real wages have gone down.
Sure. I mean, I understand the perception.
But
my brother works in the journalism industry as well, and especially in the past couple of years, I mean, it's a complete disaster. So you're in the wrong industry. If you had been a healthcare technician,
or a computer programmer.
I'm not even sure about.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
not sure about that.
Well, all my friends were doing well. That's what they're doing.
Yeah, well, that's good. I think you got unemployed computer programmers these days, but no, if you were in the healthcare field, you probably wouldn't have much to worry about. If you were in a professional or technical position. All I can say is that the numbers don't show a decline in inflation-adjusted wages for U.S. workers on the whole, on average.
And yet you say...
And my data sources are not different from anybody else's data sources.
Mm-hmm. All right, then why are you arriving at different conclusions?
I don't think I am. Okay? I think I'm arriving at the same conclusions, but that... Well, to be as even-handed as possible, people spin the data differently. Let me put it this way. Instead of talking about whether the wages have gone up or down, there's another claim that's made, which is that the U.S. workers' share, wages and salaries as a share of U.S. national income, has gone down precipitously. Okay? So... wages and salaries, the wage and salary share of U.S. income has gone down precipitously. Technically, that's true. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the data table, and this was another thing that totally surprised me. I saw this graph, published in Monthly Review, and the wage and salary share just goes way down since 1970. I went to the government table, cited as a source, and there's wages and salaries, and there's retirement benefits, and there's health benefits, and there's unemployment insurance, and Social Security payments, and welfare payments, and veterans benefits. Wages and salaries are only one part of the pay of workers. The retirement benefits that employers pay, the health benefits that employers pay, at least some of them, and the contributions that they have to make into Social Security and Medicare. That's all part of workers' total compensation. And then there's additional benefits provided by government. Forget just for the moment even the benefits provided by the government. When you look not at just the wages and salaries in this narrow sense, you hear wages and salaries can be very misleading because you think it's all of it, but it's not all of it. It's not it doesn't include the benefits. You add the benefits in, compensation has not fallen in the corporate sector as a share of corporate output or income.
And yet you say that the rate of profit has declined.
Yep.
So how do we reconcile this?
Well, if it had gone up, that would be a cause for the rate of profit to decline, if the compensation of workers had gone up. Okay. But it hasn't gone up, it's remained steady. But the rate of profit is the profit compared to the amount invested. Well, the amount invested is going up even faster than the output and the profit. The profit's, a certain percentage of the output. That's constant, but the investment's grown faster. I mean, I think the real...
Well, but if the rate of profit is declining, then there will be more of an incentive on the part of the bosses to cut wages.
Certainly.
And yet you're saying that hasn't happened.
Yeah. I mean, the incentive is basically to pay workers nothing, but you can't get away with it.
Well,
so you can't explain
sometimes
everything.
you can actually, but
yeah, well, not zero wages, but you can't explain what goes on in capitalism by what the capitalists want.
All right, so how do you explain it?
The fall in the rate of profit.
Mm-hmm. But how do you explain it not translating into a fall in real wages?
Well, why didn't the rate of profit result in falling wages?
Right.
Well, it's a fall in a rate. I mean, it hasn't resulted in a fall in profits either.
Right.
Profits are up, wages are up, they're just growing slower than they used to grow in the first part of the post-war period, and profits are growing slower than the investment. So the rate of profit falls. If that's what you're getting at. I mean, I think that to answer your question about the rate of profit falling, I mean, the simple way of answering this is there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And I could just get into this if you wanted to, but it's going to be very boring to the audience out there. But there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. But there are things that interrupt that. And one thing that interrupts that is what's known as the destruction of capital value. And that's what happened in the Great Depression, World War II. And it's mostly not physical destruction, although there was that as well. People have heard about, farmers taking the pigs that they couldn't sell the pork, and they would just plow all the pigs into a big pit. That's physical destruction. And a factory just sits there idling. That's physical destruction. But most of the destruction was...
Or a factory gets bombed.
Yeah, Dresden and so forth, but that's not so much in the U.S. So you've got the destruction of value is a much bigger deal. In other words, the debts don't get repaid, stock prices fall, all kinds of prices fall. Okay, the combination of all of that led to a situation where at the start of the post-World War II period, the capital invested in U.S. business was really very, very low. It was, I don't remember the exact number, but it basically was the capital relative to the gross domestic product was about like half of what it had been back in 1929, right at the threshold of the Depression. And since the rate of profit is your profit relative to the capital, if the capital's all kind of low like that, that boosts your rate of profit. So the rate of profit starts out high and then basically begins to fall. And then why does it begin to fall? Okay, because of the tendency. But the idea is this: if there hadn't been the destruction of capital value, the capital would have been about double what it was, and there would have been no post-war boom in profitability.
Right, well,
it would have just been basically flat.
A very key concept which we should elaborate on at greater length. But first, we need to nail down, this notion of why the rate of profit falls, because saying that that happens because it's the tendency is tautological.
Yes.
Why does the rate of profit fall?
It was not an explanation.
Yeah.
It was an attempt to just put a marker there.
Yes.
Okay. Let me just forget theory for a moment and tell you what I found.
Okay.
The rate of profit basically does not fall because the capitalists are getting a smaller share of what's produced. Okay? That's true for a very finite period. Talking about the U.S. corporate sector. True for a very finite period, 1965, 1970. The workers' share went up, the capitalist share went down, the corporation share, and that never returned. But except for that 65 to 70 period, none of the movement in the rate of profit is really accountable in terms of distribution. The workers getting more, or the capitalists getting less. Okay. Another thing is all kinds of factors could cause the rate of profit to fall because prices are tending to fall. It's not the prices are tending to fall. The rate of growth of prices is tending to fall compared to how much labor it takes to produce the goods and services. What I found is that relationship between the rate of profit that you would compute, assuming that prices don't rise compared to how much labor it takes to produce, and the relationship between the one assumes that the prices don't rise relative to that, and the actual one, it just fluctuates. So basically, there is no real effect on the rate of profit, taking the period from 47 to 2007. Movements in prices relative to the amount of labor it takes to produce stuff doesn't explain any movement in the rate of profit. The distributional thing, except for 65 to 1970, doesn't explain any of it. Now, what is left, just mathematically, and here's the key point. Once you've excluded those two factors, which you can exclude them, what is left is a relationship between employment and the accumulation or investment of capital. The rate of profit will fall if employment grows more slowly than the investment in capital. And that's what happened. I mean, this is a very technical argument. It's very hard to explain. So I'm sure I've lost everybody. I wouldn't understand it if I was listening to this.
The whole notion of...
But the point is this. The point is this. You go back to Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 3. This is what he says. This is his tendency for the rate of profit to fall. But it just drops out mathematically as the only explanation once you have said it's not a matter of distributional changes, and once you've said it's not a matter of a changing relationship between the growth of prices compared to the amount of labor it takes to produce the commodities. What drops out is the relationship between employment growth and the growth of the capital.
Okay. Well, before we move on to the countervailing tendency, which is the destruction of value, maybe we should take a brief musical break.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a tower to the sun, brick and mortar and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once in khaki suits, oh, we looked so swell, full of that Yankee doodly-dum. 500,000 boots went slogging through hell. I was a kid with a drum. Say, don't you remember my name was Al? Al all the time. Say, don't you remember I was your pal? Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Can you spare a dime? Thank you.
All right, so in a possible case of the cure being worse than the disease, you're arguing that the only alternative to the falling rate of profit is destruction of value, which most dramatically happened with the Depression in the 1930s, immediately followed by the war in the 1940s. And then we had the sustained boom after that, and then what happened? Then, as we discussed the last time when you were on the radio, when you were on WBAI 2 or 3 years ago, the fall of 2008, just when the system seemed to be on the brink of collapse, you were saying that not enough value was destroyed after the recession of the 1970s. We didn't have a massive crisis such as existed in the 30s, and that's why maybe we're facing one today.
Yeah, the problems were not resolved. I mean, in the end, what happened in the Great Depression and World War II did resolve the problems of the Great Depression. And there was a post-war boom. Then you had this crisis and deep recession in the mid-'70s and into the early '80s, another phase of that. You didn't have a new boom come out of that. Why didn't you have a new boom come out of that? You didn't have a deep enough slump to create the conditions for a boom.
Well, again, I guess you're drawing a distinction between a boom and a bubble, because most people would argue that there was a boom in the 80s, and there was a boom in the 90s.
Oh, sure.
With a little recession in between.
Sure. But these are unsustainable.
Mm-hmm. Right, we didn't have a sustained boom such as
occurred really after the war
early 70s.
Into the exactly. It wasn't a real new expansionary phase. It was short-term periods of rapid growth, which I'm not going to make a claim about the 1980s, but certainly I'll make a claim about the 1990s and the 2000s, the last decade, that those expansions were fueled by a run-up of asset prices that was unsustainable. I mean, how did it work in the last decade? Okay, people had these homes. The homes kept going up in price. There were these home equity lines of credit. You could use your home as an ATM machine. So, you take out, price goes up $25,000. You go to the lender. You say, give me a $25,000 home equity line of credit. And then you got $25,000 of cash that you didn't have that you can spend. Lots of people are doing that, and the economy's going like gangbusters. Okay, and it's all predicated on continued growth of the home prices. The whole thing goes in reverse. You got a big problem. So that's really the difference between the growth that you get that's really fueled by a bubble and a real expansion. When you're getting spending rising faster than the actual incomes are rising, that's not a sustainable boom that we're talking about. That's just borrowing and having a good time with borrowed money, which is basically what the United States has been doing for a few decades, until the latest crash. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're doing it right now as well because the U.S. government's been borrowing like crazy to make sure that we don't have another depression.
All right, well, in the 80s, apparently, we were borrowing from Germany and Japan. Now I understand we're borrowing from China.
Yeah, a lot from China. A lot of the debt that was issued by the Treasury in the past couple of years was bought up by Chinese banks, Chinese government, and so forth.
And the debt crisis that everybody talked about in the 1980s was that of, the so-called third world, India and Brazil and Mexico and so on. Now, whatever happened to those debts? People don't talk so much about the debt crisis in the third world, but I don't imagine those countries are out of debt.
No, I think that probably to some extent...
Some of it was forgiven by the IMF and the World Bank and so on in exchange for neoliberal restructuring.
Yeah, I actually don't know what happened. I mean, most of the money was owed to banks in the United States, big banks in the United States. Were they bailed out by the U.S. government? I don't actually know. I just have to take a pass on that one.
All right. Well, in any event, what happened in the 1970s? Why did the sustained post-war boom end at that particular point?
Well, I think,
and I'll just, if I can, just,
a lot of it has to do with rising oil prices.
Yes.
Causing conditions to deteriorate very rapidly, and the rise in oil prices has a lot to do, I think, also as well. I mean, certainly with the Arab-Israeli War of '73, but also with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. You call it the dollar.
The international gold standard.
International gold standard, yeah. I think those two things had a lot to do with why a lot of tendencies that were building up for decades came to fruition at that point. And the U.S. also, one should say, had a fairly protected status coming out of World War II because it was really the only major capitalist power to emerge from the war essentially unscathed. So it didn't have many competitors, and there was not a great volume of international trade, relatively speaking. So it enjoyed a protected situation. Once you get into the 70s, you no longer have that. I mean, the extent of so-called globalization is overblown, but if you just want to look at, for instance, the share of U.S. auto sales that come from U.S. production, it's...
began to decline in the 70s.
Yeah, and it just keeps declining.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's way, way lower than it used to be. Steel production, I don't think there is any left in the United States.
Very little.
Yeah, in certain industries, there has been... global competition that matters and has affected the U.S. economy. I don't think it's huge overall, because what happens is you adjust. You're not doing steel, you do something else. So the U.S. is doing something; it's still able to compete, but not in certain industries. At least not like it was. Mm-hmm. So. I don't think that I can give a full account of exactly what went on in the 70s because I didn't really try to discuss that in the book, try to account for that slump. I'm really dealing mostly with what's happened thereafter.
You do put 73 as the year that the post-war boom ended, which was notoriously the year of the OPEC oil shock.
Absolutely.
Or more correctly, the Arab oil shock. Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly. All I'm saying is I don't try to give a theoretical explanation of exactly why we had that
All right,
slump.
so is, another crisis of, massive destruction of value and inevitability?
No, there's never any inevitability. I mean, people are, first of all, rising up, protesting, saying they're not going to take it. The likes that I've never seen, probably have never seen, and it's happening a lot quicker than happened in the Great Depression. If you think about, like, the United States, the radicalization of working people in the Great Depression, the key moment was the occupation of the factories. That was the Occupy movement, the CIO, the sit-down strikes that formed the CIO.
Which was 37?
That was like the end of 37, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so if you date the Great Depression to 29, you're talking 8 years in. Okay, if you say the end of 07 is the beginning of the Great Recession, we're only 4 years in. And we've had Arab Spring, we've had the events in Wisconsin, we've had all of the Occupy things. Lots of stuff in Greece, Italy. The largest strike in Britain since the 20s just took place. It was a one-day strike, but there's a lot of ferment now. So nothing is inevitable.
Okay, but what's the alternative to? I mean, this is sort of?
I think that a massive slump of the Great Depression type is probably less likely than a continuation of what we've had for several decades now, which is kicking the can down the road, papering over bad debt with more debt. Mm-hmm. That's what was done with the third world debt crisis.
And yet, when I had you on the radio back in around this time of year, in the late fall of 2008, if memory serves, you were arguing that, in fact, your catchphrase was, "It's worse than they want you to think," and that, in fact, the global system was poised at the brink of collapse. And now I will point out that the New York Times and the Economist are saying this regarding what's happening with Europe at the moment. They're actually invoking the possibility of, by year's end, a collapse of the euro, which could bring about a general depression. They're actually using this phrase, people like Paul Krugman, and even the editors of The Economist, who are far to the right of him. So
it could happen.
It seems to me that whatever we're looking at now, it's not quite the same thing as kicking the can down the road, which has been going on since the end of the post-war boom. We seem to be approaching something more significant. Of course, they could be able to pull it back from the brink, and as they did in 2008.
Right. I don't have a real clear sense of what, in particular, Germany was trying to accomplish last week. It's just not feasible that all the members of the EU are going to go for this plan. It's very hard for me to figure this out, what they're trying to do. The real question is, will there be a political will among the policymakers, the central banks of the world, to just cover over the bad debt with more bad debt? This is debt owed by the weaker countries of Europe to banks in Europe and elsewhere. Can it go on indefinitely? Well, yeah, it goes on. The way it goes on, crisis, crisis, crisis. You paper it over, another crisis. You paper it over, bigger crisis. They keep getting bigger, these crises.
Yes.
Okay? But they've managed to paper them over. Okay? I think that this is the most likely scenario. I mean, unless we get people just saying we're not going to take this anymore, from below. I think this is more likely than, a huge all-out destruction of capital value. I mean, I think that the policymakers don't want that to happen. They've got very good reasons for not wanting that to happen. The people who advocated that, around 1929, 30, 31, thought the economy was going to really bounce back quickly after that. They were not.
Who advocated it, and in what terms?
Hayek, Friedrich von Hayek, Lionel Robbins, two, right-wing conservative economists. According to President Herbert Hoover in his memoirs, Andrew Mellon, the financier who was his Treasury Secretary, advocated this. And it sort of made sense.
Mellon advocated it 10 years earlier, you're saying, more than 10 years earlier.
I think he was advocating it in the midst of the Depression.
Right, during the Depression.
Yeah,
right,
yeah. And this is, you may have heard the famous expression from John Maynard Keynes, in the long run, we're all dead.
Yeah.
Well, what these people said is in the long run, you let everything collapse, the destruction of value, it all bounce back. And he says, well, in the long run, we're all dead. In the long run, it did come back. It needed some government, a big dose of government intervention to come back. But I think when these people said the long run, they weren't talking about a decade and a half. I think they were talking about, a couple of years.
And yet I don't suppose they ever rate me crow over that.
Yeah, I actually think they did.
Oh, yeah?
Let me,
Not that I missed that?
I don't know about Mellon.
Well, Hayek, I would imagine, didn't.
Let me see. I think it's a footnote, but let me see. Let me try to find
it. It's a
this.
footnote. You'll forgive me for missing it.
Oh, I forgive you for anything. I mean, you're great, Bill. He's a refugee from BAI. You got to give him some slack.
Well.
Oh, yeah, here, no, it's not a footnote.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Both Hayek and Robbins later expressed regret at having recommended that activist policies not be used to counteract the deflation of the early 1930s.
Yes. I stand corrected, sir. Yeah. I sort of had the impression that Hayek was intransigent to the end, but no, I do recall reading that passage now,
Yeah.
So how did he reconcile this afterwards with his, free market dogma? Or perhaps it wasn't really Hayek who was intransigent to the end so much as his emulators and the people who drew inspiration from him, like Friedman and Rothbard.
Well, actually, right before this, Friedman is criticizing their earlier position of letting it all go to hell.
Oh?
Yeah. This was an interview from Milton Friedman. Let me see. Where's this? Yeah, he says, if you go back to the 1930s, you had Hayek and Lionel Robbins saying you just have to let the bottom drop out of the world. You just got to let it cure itself. You can't do anything about it. You will only make it worse. He's mocking that position. So that would not be Friedman's position at all. I really don't think that there's anybody responsible out there who wants that. It still could happen. Okay? The whole thing could unravel. In the end, it's a matter of the following. You got this bad debt. Okay? You got to cover the lenders, because if you don't cover the lenders' bad debt, there's not going to be new lending. They're supposedly risk takers, but they don't want to take risks. So to ensure that the new credit's going to be coming, and without new credit, you're not going to really have capitalism. You have to have new credit, new loans. You have to restore confidence. And restoring confidence means telling the people who lend money and the institutions that lend money, you're going to be made whole no matter what. That's been the basic strategy for decades now. So what happens is the governments come around and they give money. And, it might be governments through the IMF and the bank, whatever it is. They give money, they cover the bad debt with more debt. And make the lenders whole. Now, here's the key point, though. The governments can restore confidence in this manner only if there's an expectation that, when push comes to shove, Henry Paulson, the free marketeer, will come and bail me out. Only if there's an expectation, these institutions are too big to fail, they're going to be bailed out. But then the question is, the governments can restore confidence only if there's confidence in the government. And once the debt situation really gets out of hand, it's not clear to me at all that there will be confidence in the U.S. government's ability to make the lenders whole. Mm-hmm. There's also a question now in the financial markets whether there's the will and the resolve and the basic desire to not play politics, or whether the Congress is just going to play politics over these kinds of things again and again. It seems to me undeniable that the panic in September, October of 2008 was made much worse by the Congress voting, the House of Representatives voting down TARP. And then they had a do-over a few days later. But even just that gesture of no, we're not going to make things whole, even though we could, even that really worsened the situation. And when the Congress was playing politics with the extension of the debt ceiling, that ticked off lenders. I mean, obviously it ticked off what was the Standard & Poor's or whoever downgraded U.S. debt. Once you start talking about Europe and the downgrading of government debt of other countries, then it's not just a matter of playing politics. I think it's do these countries have the ability to paper over the bad debt with more debt?
All right,
That's not so clear, yeah.
All right, there's the option of another crash. There's an option of kicking the can down the road. And then the third option, which you present, is people rising up and saying, we're not going to take it anymore. But what does that concretely mean in terms of what kind of, either, and we sort of started out this conversation by, you sort of reject the notion or critique the notion of some kind of new deal or some kind of a new accommodation with the system. And yet the notion of, destroying capitalism, of an actual anti-capitalist revolution, seems rather utopian, and it has for quite some time now. And unfortunately, it seems like the only people who have spoken openly about it in recent years have either been, extremist anarchist yahoos or really ugly Stalinist yahoos. And it seems to be, okay, so do you actually see the potential? How do you see, I mean, you're a Marxist and a Marxist humanist. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about what that tradition represents, but how do you actually see the potential for a transition to socialism in our children's lifetimes, maybe? Our lifetimes, conceivably? Or is that completely pie in the sky?
I don't think it's pie in the sky for the simple reason that when things change, they tend to change really rapidly. I mean, just think, if we were sitting here 6 months ago and I told you that there would be a worldwide movement that's drawing in youth, it's drawing in workers, and it's just spreading like wildfire throughout the world, in opposition to the corporations and to inequality and this, that, and the other. I mean, we haven't seen anything like that.
No, it's an extremely encouraging sign, without a doubt.
Right. But the point is, it happens very rapidly.
And it did happen very rapidly, seemingly out of nowhere.
Exactly,
yes.
And that's the point. It seems to come from out of nowhere.
I mean, I would argue that really, it sort of all began exactly a year ago when that out-of-work street vendor in Tunisia set himself on fire, which precipitated the Arab Spring. And I'm not sure it's a direct line from the Arab Spring to the indignados in Spain and the protests in Greece and Occupy Wall Street, but they seem to all be a part of the same ferment.
They're part of the same ferment. There's inspiration of one inspiring the others, and the worsening economic conditions are to some extent behind all of this.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And yet, there hasn't been, one of the reasons that I find Occupy Wall Street to be such a hopeful development is that, it finally, it seems to be moving towards, this global ferment seems to be moving towards an explicitly anti-capitalist analysis. But, I would argue insufficiently so. I mean, certainly in the Arab Spring, there's been, economic demands have been, really critical right from the very beginning. And there's been a real effort on the part of, the global media and the Western governments to downplay that and to sort of, frame what's going on in the Arab world simply as being about democracy, quote unquote, defined in the narrowest terms, meaning let's get rid of the dictators and move to bourgeois representative democracy, not, some kind of like more grassroots, participatory, decentralized democracy. So, and even within Occupy Wall Street, I mean, it's very interesting that you mentioned before that one of the reasons for the end of the post-war boom was going off of the international gold standard. I mean, I have been doing battle on my blog, as maybe you're aware, with the Ron Paul people who are arguing, who, by the way, there's been a big presence of down at Zuccotti Park, who are arguing exactly that, who are arguing that, the problem was getting off of the gold standard, and they actually want a more, aggressive, capitalist, laissez-faire, let the pigs run wild, just get back to sound currency and the gold standard while you do it, sort of approach to the problem, which I'm sure you agree with me is completely misguided.
Oh yeah, that's completely misguided, and you're right that people don't have a real sense of what's gone wrong and why. And to be able not just to tear down, but to create something new that's good and viable, you definitely need that. We're not there yet. We're not even nearly there. One thing that does not help is the stagism. Oh, the people are stupid and they can't figure this out, so let's tell them stuff like, oh, all 99% of us are in this together and it's just the 1%. And not only that, but all the problems in the world are really the creation of this 1%. We know that's not true, but tell them that because they're too stupid. You treat people like that, you're never going to have a development of their minds, and that's what people need, is to develop their minds so that they can create something.
Well, all right, I'm all for developing of minds, and this whole sort of antipathy to analysis and ideology and the sort of anti-intellectualism which infects the movements are very dangerous, need to be combated. But completely lost my train of thought. I should have had more coffee before we started. What were you just saying?
99%.
Yes. I mean, didn't Marx talk about 9/10 of humanity are disenfranchised from a stake in property, which is why he opposed private property? I mean, that's straight out of the manifesto, isn't it?
Okay, let me try to be more precise. I was using a metaphor. I take the 99% versus the 1% to be a metaphor.
I mean, Marx said it as the 90% versus the 10%,
right.
But
okay, I take the rhetoric of the 1% versus the 99% to be a metaphor for the problems that we face regarding the economy and regarding all else are fundamentally about the distribution of income, and that these problems can then be fixed by redistributing income downward. I take there to be not, this is not the thought of everybody in Occupy Wall Street. I mean, there are a lot of people who I want a job, I don't want to be burdened with so much debt on my student loans and a lot of this. But if you look at sort of the rhetoric that's coming from the group of people who were leading the thing in New York, it was about the corporations and it was about distribution. Okay, I don't think that the economic crisis and the Great Recession and its aftermath have anything to do with the distribution of income, at least in the sense that a maldistribution of income didn't cause this, growing inequality did not cause this, and I don't think in the least that a redistribution of income is going to solve any problems of capitalism. It'll make some people on the bottom do better, make a lot of us maybe do better, but it's not going to solve the problems of the system.
All right, what problems of the system are you referring to? Because inequality is one of the problems of the system.
Oh, well, I make a distinction between the system and the people in the system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I don't think the system is our system. I think it's a system on its own. It's got its own logic. It's not a human system. Okay, so it's not our system.
It's not a human system.
No, it's not a human system.
Well, it's made up of human beings. It's run by human beings.
It's run by human beings that play certain social roles. Marx called the capitalists personifications of capital. So it's just like the Greek tragedies, where you had personifications. The actors, are the actors on the stage the characters? No.
The capitalist functions only as personified capital. The rule of the capitalist over the worker is actually the rule of things, capital, over man, of the product, capital, over the producer. I actually highlighted that passage. That's from Capital, I assume.
I think it was preparatory manuscript that he chucked right at the end. He was going to put a chapter in to bridge between Volume 1 and Volume 2, and he chucked that out at the last moment. But I think it's in, if you have like the Penguin edition of Volume 1, it's called The Results of the Immediate Process of Production. I think it's in the back there.
Okay.
Great passage.
Yeah.
Personifications. So the capitalists are not people in that sense. They're people who play the role of capitalists. But what is it to be a capitalist? It's try to take money and make more money out of it. But it's not. This is not a human goal because it's not for their consumption. Because what do? They don't take the money and buy stuff and consume it, although they do that to some extent, but they plow it back. And if they don't plow it back, their business doesn't grow. They go under and they join the ranks of the regular workers, and they don't want that. And the successful capitalists, the ones that remain, are the ones who accumulate, who plow the money back in production to make the system grow. These are not human names. These are not human aims. And so, you asked about Marxist humanism. This is a key part of Marxist humanism, is that it's not just like a bad system or a system where the rich, are evil and they've got a lot and we don't like that, and greed. It's fundamentally an inhuman system. It's a system
Okay,
that's
we need to define the term.
run
What do you
for
mean by inhuman?
It's ahuman. It's not oriented toward human beings and our
it certainly
lives
is
and our
not.
development.
No, it certainly is not.
Okay, but
Absolutely.
it's not a question of some human beings doing it to other human beings. Okay? It's not fundamentally that question. If you put other human beings in control, but you have a system that works in the same way, it's going to end up in the same place. And we've seen that again and again. Look at the great achievements of Stalinism and social democracy.
Yeah, well, you're being sarcastic, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, look. Let me give you another example. I talk about this in the end of the book. What have these guys been trying to save? The Treasury secretaries, the Fed, have they been trying to save the corporations? Was TARP about bailing out the corporations and so forth? When Bear Stearns got bailed out, it wasn't a bailout of Bear Stearns. The Fed said, okay, Bear Stearns, you're gone. We want to sell off your shares for $2 a share. The market price at that time was $30. Okay, they sold them off to another company, J.P. Morgan Chase. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, big mortgage guarantors. Okay, the government comes along and bails them out. Didn't bail them out. The shareholders are basically wiped out. When the bailout occurred, the price per share, which was already way down, was over $10 a share. Now it's 20 cents per share. They didn't bail out the shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
They bailed out the system.
They bailed, specifically they bailed out the lenders. Okay? But it's not like we like the lenders and we don't like the shareholders. The point is, if you don't have the lenders being bailed out, you're not going to have new lending. If you don't have new lending, the system comes to a halt. The system starts to come to a halt, you start to have mass revolt on your hands. You don't want that.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly they don't want that.
Right, certainly they don't want it, but it's not to help any particular group of individuals. It's to help this system. And this system has a fundamentally non-human, ahuman aim of just expanding itself.
Yes, this is true. It does. Yes.
Yeah, this is not like a slave owner and slaves.
But there's an aspect of that to it.
Oh, there's an aspect of that. But it used to be the case, the slaves would work, the slave owners got all they wanted to eat and enjoy and so forth, and they led a very good life, and that was the end of it. Okay? The slaves were working for the slave owner. Here, you're working to expand value. You're just working to expand capital, to grow.
And yet the rich continue to exist.
Sure.
Yeah.
But is it always the same people?
Well, does that matter?
No. But it does matter if you think that the system is about enriching certain people. The rich, control the system, and this runs for their benefit. The whole idea of those...
The system doesn't run for the benefit of the rich?
No.
No?
No, I don't think so. I think that's, a consequence of what happens. But see, this is also an issue. When you talk about the 1% and the 99%, you get the impression that these are two stable groups of people. 99% here, 1% here. I don't think that's the case. That 1%...
There's a certain degree of, room at the top, they're telling you still,
Yeah.
There's a certain degree of social mobility, but it seems to me less and less, and by and large, there isn't that much class mobility.
No, but there's not a lot of class mobility. But, a lot of this 1%, you hear, all the income gains, or almost all of them, are gone to the top 1%. Okay? it's not the same group of people. Some people make a killing in the stock market one year, you know, they move into the 1%. Next year, they don't make a killing, they're down into the 3rd%. The next year, they get a loss, they're in the 4th%, and other people are moving in. So, you know, within that top group, there's a lot of movement. Okay, I'm just saying the 1%.
Right, but that's with movement within the 1%.
No, that's movement within maybe the top.
Well, I'm using the 1%.
Right, it's movement
in the cash
top.
price sense.
It's not. It's
10%.
Yeah, we don't have many Horatio Alger stories.
Yeah,
That's what you said.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. No. There's no Horatio Alger stories.
All right, well, to wrap it up in the 5 minutes remaining to us, so can you explain, for us what Marxism humanism is and how it differs from the other flavors of Marxism which are out there, and how you actually perceive a transition to socialism potentially taking place?
Okay. Right, 5 minutes, sure.
Yeah.
Marxist humanism emerged as a response to Stalinism. Basically, there was what Brya-Dunevskaya, the founder of Marxist humanism in the U.S., called a veritable conspiracy between Moscow and Washington to make it seem like what was in the Russian system was Marxism. It was really the antithesis of Marxism, and so she went back and recovered the humanism of Marx as expressed in his early writings, but it really pervaded all of his thought. Now, I think that that's all still fundamental to Marxist humanism, but it's not just a question of Russia. I mean, the Soviet system is gone. It has an abiding message, Marxist humanism does, beyond that, because I think of the analysis of capitalism as a system that is not fundamentally a system of human beings for human beings. It's not even running for the benefit of the rich. It's running for the benefit of itself. And as you, it's there in Marx in the passage that you quoted, and that's from a later writing. I fundamentally don't think that there's a transition to socialism in the sense of having an intermediate society. I don't think you can kind of combine capitalism with something else. I mean, capitalism is totalizing, and it takes anything it comes into contact with and just rips it apart and transforms it.
Hence my question.
Yeah. So obviously there's got to be a transition in the sense politically of here's where we are now, and we got to move forward, and there's got to be people coming to grips with what is the real nature of the economic crisis and the problems and how we can get out of it. But fundamentally, the one system has to be replaced by the other. And it has to be replaced really on a world scale, because if it were just, replaced piecemeal, again, you'd have the problem of the system that's capitalism trying to have something coexist with it, and things don't coexist well with capitalism.
But again, how do you, it was Rosa Luxemburg who juxtaposed socialism or barbarism. Well, I totally get that, but unfortunately right now I see barbarism as a much, much more likely option, given, the complete evisceration of, apart from in certain very limited circles, expanding circles at the moment, fortunately, but still very limited circles, there isn't that much anti-capitalist or socialist thought out there.
You're absolutely right. Is it more likely? Probably. But again, things can happen suddenly that appear to come from out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So there is some reason to hope. The real problem that we face is that we don't have any clear idea of what has to be changed in order to have a modern society that is not, in the end, based on capitalist principles. Okay? When people get this idea that it's the wrong people in control, that's the worst part of this way of thinking. Oh, these people are controlled, the neoliberals or the 1%. The idea that people have is if we put in other people into control, the 99%, or the not neoliberals, or whoever it is, all we need is different people making different decisions, and it'll all be fine. I don't think that for a moment.
All right,
I think capitalism works according to certain principles, and they have to be undone and new ones put in place.
As you can read in Andrew Kliman, The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying Causes of the Great Recession. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Bill, for having me on.
Radical environmentalism for the
So, and thank you for watching out there in cyberspace, and see you soon, I hope.
History of rebel culture. The Moorish Orthodox Radio Crusade. Exiled from WBAI 99.5 FM in New York City. Now only on the World Wide Web. Be there.